Right. Good morning, senators. Bonjour, sénateurs et sénatrices. I'm absolutely delighted to join our co-chair, Senator Jim Quinn, in welcoming all of you to this Senators for Climate Solutions session entitled The Importance of Critical Minerals in Canada and the World's Transition to a Net Zero Economy, Ensuring a Robust Industry with Secure, Sustainable, and Responsible Supply Chains. I'm Senator Mary Coyle, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm very pleased to co-host this panel with Jim. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you and a very special thank you to our newest members of Senators for Climate Solutions, Senator Pierre Moreau, Senator Alistair Surrett, Senator Beltej Dillon, and with us today, Senators Tracy Muckley and Senator Sandra Pupatello. It's wonderful to have you all with us, as well as, of course, our senators who've been with us for quite some time. We'd like to begin by acknowledging, as we do, that those of us currently in Ottawa, and I'm in Ottawa, are gathered on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We recognize and honor Indigenous peoples across Canada and their stewardship of the lands on which all of us are situated for this session today. Today's conversation couldn't be more timely. It'll focus on a critical, no pun intended, aspect of Canada's clean economy future. As nations race towards net zero, demand is growing for critical minerals, the essential inputs for clean technologies such as electric vehicles, batteries, wind turbines, solar panels, hydrogen development, etc. Of course, there's also a lot of Trump-induced turmoil in our global and domestic economy at this time. So it'll be important to hear what our panelists have to say about this reality and its impacts on both demand and supply of critical minerals. Canada is rich in these mineral resources, but scaling up production sustainably and responsibly while also securing our place in the global supply chain requires strategic action, collaboration, and the appropriate policies and regulatory environment, and that's our bailiwick. It's also an ideal follow-up to our November panel, which was, just to remind people, reimagining the future, prosperity in Canada's net zero economy. We're honored to be joined by three exceptional panelists who will help us explore how Canada can rise to this opportunity, including in this moment of some uncertainty, a lot of uncertainty actually, how we can meet our climate and economic goals and lead the world in secure, sustainable, and responsible mineral development. Now I'll move on to the introduction of our panelists. It is my absolute pleasure. Oh, I think everybody who's on here knows how to use the interpretation. Yeah. Oh, hello, Clément. Welcome. Nice to see you. And Senator Ringuette. Okay, good to see everybody. So I'm about to introduce today's speakers. We're really thrilled to have our three speakers today. And we're going to start with Marissa Beck. She's the Director of Clean Growth Research at the Canadian Climate Institute. And we've had other speakers from the Climate Institute with us on previous panels. Always top-notch. She'll begin with an overview of why critical minerals matter, why they're essential to the net zero transition, what global and domestic demand looks like and for which minerals, highlighting the priority minerals for Canada and where Canada currently stands in terms of production. Marissa will also provide a brief overview of the federal critical minerals strategy for us. For the industry perspective, we'll hear from Pierre Gratton. I like the French pronunciation of your name, Pierre. President and CEO of the Mining Association of Canada. He'll provide an overview of the Canadian mining sector with specific reference to the critical minerals, in particular those key to our transition to net zero. We know there are critical minerals for other purposes such as defense. He will share his insights on the opportunities and challenges for Canada's mining sector, including regulatory hurdles, permitting, and investment conditions. We'll also hear from his colleague, Fotini Koutsaflis, Vice President, Economic Affairs and Climate Change at the Mining Association of Canada, who will expand on Pierre's remarks, speaking to ESG, environmental, social, and governance standards, financing, and what's needed to move from exploration to production in a responsible manner. So then Marissa will come back on. She's going to bookend this and return for a second segment focused on environmental, community, and policy considerations, including how we align mineral development with climate goals and Indigenous engagement. The Canadian Climate Institute will be coming out with a new critical minerals report in June, so Marissa's contributions today will be timely. I've mentioned the interpretation option at the bottom right of your Zoom window to select your preferred language. And after the presentations today by our panelists, Senator Quinn will pop back on and he will moderate a question and answer period. And he'll explain to you how to do that. So now without further ado, let's move on to the presentations themselves. So, Marissa, let's start with you. Could you please start us off with an overview of the role of critical minerals in the clean energy transition, the projected increase in demand, and how Canada is currently positioned in terms of production and policy? We'd also appreciate, if possible, a brief snapshot of that critical minerals strategy as is in place and Canada's priority minerals. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Senator Coyle. Dear Senators, good morning. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to speak with you today. As Senator Coyle said, I'm with the Canadian Climate Institute, Canada's leading climate policy research organization, and we produce rigorous independent research and evidence to inform better policymaking on climate change in Canada at all levels of government. I'm heading the Clean Growth team here, and as was said before, we are just finishing up a major report on critical minerals, so I will draw in my remarks on our findings from that report. It'll be published in June. So I'll kick us off with some general information about critical minerals. So let's start off with a definition. What are critical minerals? So essentially, critical minerals are metallic and non-metallic elements, but what makes them critical? So they're considered critical mainly because of two key properties of these materials. The first one is they are essential ingredients to the technologies that we consider to already be or to become in the future the key drivers of economic growth. And they are first and foremost, of course, we're thinking about meeting emission reduction targets and the clean energy transition that is necessary to meet those climate targets. So critical minerals are required for important clean technologies such as solar PV modules, wind turbines, batteries, EVs, charging stations, and so on. Also, in other sectors, critical minerals are key and essential: semiconductor production, lots of military applications, digitalization of the economy more broadly. I think we're focusing today on the clean energy aspect of these materials. So that's one property. The second property is they are vulnerable to supply chain disruptions. Multiple factors contribute to that property. And the first one, I think, is that there's really a small number of global producers and processors at this time. China is certainly a dominant player. You've read probably lots of headlines on that in even recent days, even just yesterday. And these kind of small group of established players are realizing huge economies of scale. They're very experienced, making entry for others harder. So we have that kind of concentrated market power, a small group of powerful players, which then also makes that sector and these materials more vulnerable to geopolitics. And there's a current example, of course, in the escalating trade war between China and the US. Critical minerals play a key role here. They are really at the center of some of these difficult relationships right now. And also, supply chains are vulnerable to disruption because there's just resource constraints. There are limited reserves globally of a lot of these materials, and getting these materials to market is not always straightforward. We'll focus a lot of our remarks on kind of some of the challenges that Canada is facing in that sense. Delays and disruptions are common. So in terms of what these minerals actually are, what are considered critical, different governments have really different lists that they're working with of what they define as critical minerals. And these lists are also subject to change depending on how these factors that I just outlined are changing over time. Canada currently operates with a list of 34 elements. Is particularly emphasizing 6 that are seen as specifically critical. Those are lithium, graphite, nickel, copper, cobalt, and rare earth elements. So the next question there, critical, why do governments care so much about these? Because taken together, the properties that I just outlined of critical minerals really make these materials hugely important factors in securing energy security. As we're going through the clean energy transition, nations need access to these materials to build their clean technologies to power their economies. And they're also becoming matters of national security at this point because these supply chains are so vulnerable to disruption. Securing these materials has huge economic and political importance right now. So we're seeing governments around the world putting in place strategies to either develop their own reserves of critical minerals or to make sure they have good import relationships, diversified supply chains to make their supply of these essential materials more resilient against any shocks and disruptions that we may see. Maybe one last note on definitions. We're often grouping critical minerals together as if they were kind of one homogeneous thing. They're of course not. So even the 6 priority minerals that I just listed, they're very different in many respects in terms of their market values, kind of their chemical characteristics, the mining technologies that are necessary to unearth them, their uses and applications and so on. I'm not going to go into greater detail, but that's just important to keep in mind. They're not one homogeneous group of elements. So let's look a little bit at global demand projections. Just very broadly, demand is expected to grow. No wonder, as we're moving into a clean energy future. So by 2050, demand for critical minerals could increase by 3 to 90 times, depending on which mineral you're looking at and which policy scenario. Policy scenario, we're specifically thinking about energy policy and climate policy here. So for example, according to projections from the International Energy Agency, demand for lithium, key input to battery manufacturing, is expected to grow between 11 and 17 times between 2023 and 2050. We are looking at kind of the investment side of things. Another estimate, the global mining sector will need additional capital investment of between 480 billion US dollars and 750 billion US dollars to produce and process the critical materials at the pace and scale required for the clean energy transition. So these are big numbers, large values. So the economic upside of developing and processing these materials for Canada is enormous. In a scenario where the world meets its climate pledges, we expect that the annual demand for critical minerals will reach a value of 770 billion Canadian dollars by 2040. So in short, just to wrap that up, the world needs more critical minerals now to enable the technologies that we need for emission reductions, to reach our emission reduction targets, to build these technologies. And that is true even in ambitious recycling scenarios. So just a word on recycling here. In the long run, they are really important and significant opportunities for circularity and recycling of these materials, which then would mean that in the very long run, the need for new extraction will slow down significantly, but we're not there yet. Right now, there's actually not enough materials in circulation right now to meet current demand. But just to give an example of the potential for circularity and recycling, some EV batteries have components that can be recovered at rates of as high as 95%. And again, the International Energy Agency estimates that recycling could reduce the demand for new mining by 25 to 40% by 2050. We're not there yet. So right now, there's not enough material in circulation to meet our current demands. But in the long run, that is to be considered. Coming back to Canada a little bit, what does this all mean for Canada? So there's a huge opportunity, actually. Canada has ample reserves of some of these minerals, and their extraction and processing can therefore become quite significant drivers of economic growth. Canadian minerals could meet both domestic demand, I'm thinking here in particular of the kind of emerging battery manufacturing industry, but also help others, trading partners in the European Union. In the US, the relationship is shaky right now, but generally in the US and in other nations, to secure and diversify their supply chains. And especially in Europe, there's a huge demand for that, to make sure Europe doesn't have a lot of these materials themselves, to make sure their imports, their supply chains are secure. So there are reserves of various critical minerals in Canada distributed across provinces and territories. And also what is important here, I think that expanding on the development of these resources and the processing really could help Canada capitalize of some of the economic strengths that we have already. We have a very well-regulated financial sector with extensive mining experience. The Toronto Stock Exchange is actually the mining stock exchange in the world. We have a relatively higher environmental, social, and governance standards. It sounds like Fotini will speak to that later on more. Proximity to buyers, and we have a low carbon power grid with relatively competitive electricity rates. And all of these factors together could really help Canada secure a very advantageous position in global markets. We're also facing challenges. And the biggest one, I think, right now that we will discuss today is that there's currently a huge investment gap in the sector. So current investment in Canada's upstream mining of critical minerals is not keeping pace both with the growth in domestic demand and the projected growth in kind of global demand. So based on our analysis at the Climate Institute, we estimate that Canada requires new investment between about 30 billion Canadian dollars and $65 billion by 2040. So the lower bound is here just to meet domestic demand. The higher bound would be to also meet some export demand. Looking at the policies that Canada has currently in place on critical minerals. So first and foremost, we do have a federal critical mineral strategy that was released in December 2022. It focuses on 6 main areas or objectives, namely to drive research, innovation, and exploration, to accelerate project development, build sustainable infrastructure for mining, specifically transportation infrastructure, but also electricity grid infrastructure, advancing reconciliation with Indigenous peoples, growing a diverse workforce and prosperous communities, and strengthening global leadership and security. Just on the reconciliation point, one important note to make is that most, if not all, of the reserves are on or near Indigenous traditional territories. So that the partnership development with Indigenous peoples around critical minerals is a big topic. I'll come back to that later in my remarks as well. The launch of the report, of the strategy was backed by a budget of close to $4 billion. It's mostly managed by the Strategic Innovation Fund and the Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund to support project development. There are other investment incentives and federal initiatives in place for this sector. I'm just going to mention the Critical Minerals Exploration Tax Credit. There's a Minerals Exploration Tax Credit. There's investment tax credit for clean technology manufacturing. At the federal level, there's also the Critical Minerals Center of Excellence, housed out of NRCan, the Indigenous Center for Excellence of Mineral Development, and the Ministerial Working Group on Regulatory Efficiency for Clean Growth Projects. These are all initiatives meant to streamline and accelerate project development in the critical mineral mining sector. At the provincial and territorial level, also several strategies and policies have been introduced recently. So the subnational governments, more and more subnational governments are adopting strategies with attached policy packages as well. I think what is standing out here may be British Columbia. I'm just going to give a brief overview here as an example. The BC Critical Mineral Strategy sets 3 goals. It's First Nations reconciliation, attracting investment in the sector, and establishing partnerships in the critical minerals sector. Just as an example, governments of Alberta, Manitoba, Newfoundland, Labrador, Northwest Territories, Nova Scotia, Ontario, Quebec, and Saskatchewan have also all adopted critical mineral strategies, recognizing the strategic importance of this sector. I'm going to leave it here for general opening remarks and hand over to the next speaker. I'll return later on with more comments on policy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marissa. Wow. You covered a lot of ground, because there is a lot of ground. When we first started talking about this event, we realized that we probably have enough for about five panels, but we're going to give you the overview in this event, and if we need a follow-up, we will do that. We're putting a link we have put a link to the critical minerals strategy, the federal critical minerals strategy, in the chat. I'd like to, just on behalf of the interpreters, ask that all of those who are speaking and later asking questions as well, to place your microphone between your nose and your mouth, if possible, in that little space. And if you have a blurred background on, could you turn it off because that is interfering for some reason with the sound. Okay. Now, going to move on to Pierre and Fotini. We'd love to hear your views on the role of the mining industry in securing Canada's place in global supply chains. What are the key opportunities? What are our biggest bottlenecks? How do permitting, infrastructure, financing, and ESG standards affect industry growth? And what's needed to bridge the gap from exploration to responsible production? So I'm going to hand it over to both of you to share this next stage, and you will do that as you wish between both Pierre and Fotini.
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to kick things off. My apologies to the interpreters because I think we supplied some remarks, but Marissa covered a lot of what I was going to say, so I'm just going to speak more off the cuff, which is perhaps more interesting anyway. I think what's been really striking, well, first, just who we are. So I'm the president and CEO of the Mining Association of Canada. We represent the majority of Canada's mining producers. Not the explorers. You've probably all heard of the PDAC and their convention every year in Toronto. They represent the exploration community, the ones who go and find new mines. We represent the companies that build and operate those mines. And we have a large number of members producing a wide range of commodities, some of them critical minerals, some of them other products as well. And from coast to coast to coast. The only province where we don't have activity is Prince Edward Island. So if we could go to the next slide. Well, actually, before we move on, another thing that I should mention, and we'll come back to it as well. One of the key initiatives of the Mining Association and of Canada, and also one of our conditions of membership, is called Towards Sustainable Mining, which is the very first mining standard ever developed that's site level based in the world. We've been implementing it, operating it now for over 20 years. So every year members have to evaluate their performance against a suite of 34 performance indicators, and every 3 years they have to have that performance independently assured. And the initiative has been overseen from the outset by a multi-stakeholder panel, which includes representatives from our three First Nations groups, the Métis Inuit and First Nations, as well as environmental NGOs, organized labor, the financial sector, our customers, and mining communities. So it's a very central piece of what we do here in Canada. It's now been exported to 12 other countries around the world. 12 other mining associations have adopted this program, with more expected to this year. So we've really sort of set the benchmark for responsible practice that is now being embraced by others. So that's also a key part, because as we think about the volume of material that Marissa just described that we're going to need in order to address the energy, facilitate the energy transition, but also to meet our needs, our geopolitical needs, our economic needs across other sectors of the economy, it's going to be absolutely critical that we mine these products responsibly. It's been a very interesting half dozen years or so since critical minerals came to the fore. I think for many years, mining we're not a consumer-facing industry for the most part. I mean, you will go to a store and buy a gold necklace or a gold ring. There might be a diamond in it. Whether people think about where that came from, I'm not sure. But for the most part, what mines produce go into products, consumer-facing products that are then bought. Nobody really thinks what goes into them. Whether it's your computer, your iPhone, your car, you name it, people don't really think. No one goes to the store and buys a pound of nickel. We do have a coin that's called a nickel, but but that's about as close as we get. Yet when you think about it, mining has been at the core of human evolution. No other sector has ages of history named after specific mining products like we do. And I think the focus on critical minerals has really reminded so many people, certainly policymakers, but I think the public generally, about where things come from and the essential need, or what the mining sector produces, particularly with a focus on, the energy transition, but really, as Marissa also mentioned, there's many, many applications that are considered to be critical for the future of the global economy. Next slide, Fatini. There's a wide range of risks. Marissa spoke to a number of them, but I thought maybe what I'd do here, rather than repeat what she said, is just make an observation about what's been happening over the last few weeks with all of with the trade war that's underway and the Trump tariffs. I think it's noteworthy, in case you missed it, but one of the areas that was not subject to tariff are critical minerals. They're within North America. If your products are subject to CUSMA, you're tariff-free. And so as long as our members are able to, ensure that their exports comply with CUSMA, there won't be any tariffs on the products that they export to the United States. I think that's just another signal of how the United States, but also how everyone views the critical nature of critical minerals. And of course, we've seen, for all the hyperbole coming out of the president, whether it's his interest in Greenland or Canada or Ukraine, so much of the focus has been on their critical mineral endowments, including our own. And the biggest war within the trade war with China really does speak to the risks that the United States is feeling, the very genuine risks that I think we also feel as Canadians, that China has, kind of by stealth, without people paying too much attention, I think in the hopes that China would evolve to be more of a market-based, market-friendly economy. And we found out that was not to be the case, but we thought that they were, as they were busy going around the world, slowly but surely acquiring virtual monopolies in the production of many, many commodities, including rare earths, but also their control now of nickel, or virtual control of nickel, through investments in Indonesia, the world's largest producer of nickel, and other places. They have a disproportionate influence over commodity prices, and it makes it very difficult for other, especially publicly traded companies, which is of course what we do here in Canada, to break into a market where China controls the price effectively. So it's a very, very challenging situation. Hence the critical mineral strategy for Canada and for many other countries around the world. Our strategy has really focused on the entire value chain, a very strong focus on the energy transition, but not exclusively. Rare earths have multiple applications, for example, as do some of the other commodities that the six groups that Marissa mentioned. But really looking at the entire value chain. And I would say, if we go to the next slide, Fatini, there's been an awful lot of focus, we would say, on the downstream. Over 46 billion has been attracted into Canada and new investment into the electric vehicle and battery supply chain since 2020. You all know of some of these, the names of some of these companies. You also know that some of them are also facing some challenges. But there's been less of a focus until the last few years on supplying those minerals and metals that those firms are going to need. And the irony that if we don't actually start producing more, we are actually just exposing Canada to greater geopolitical risk, because these companies are going to have to import more from China to build the electric vehicle supply chain, whether it's the cars themselves, whether it's cathodes, you name it, the different components of cars. We may have to import more if we don't start increasing our production. And I say that because over the last 20 to 25 years, the production of many of what are now called critical minerals, whether it be nickel, copper, cobalt, Canadian production has actually declined, and declined not insignificantly. So we really do need to turn that around. The last few years have seen federal budgets focus on helping to incentivize that activity, and Fatini will get into a bit more of that in her remarks. But that is certainly a really important need right now. If we don't start producing more, we are putting ourselves at greater risk. Some may also observe that enthusiasm for electric vehicles appears to be waning in some places, certainly in the United States, though it's kind of curious looking at the United States because of the preponderant role that Elon Musk and Tesla seems to play in U.S. politics at the moment, and the advantages that people have highlighted for Tesla as a result of U.S. policies. So that goes hand in hand with the U.S. president sort of talking down a focus on the energy transition and electric vehicles. So there's a bit of doublespeak going on there. But a lot of people have pointed to the fact sort of that sales of EVs, because they tend to be more expensive because of the components that go into electric vehicles, all the extra metal that you need makes these vehicles more expensive, that there has been a decline in the rate of sales. But that North American reality is not the same as what's happening in Europe. And I guess I would say as well that regardless of what may be happening in the United States now, I think generally most people feel that this trend is going to continue. There will be bumps along the road. And just to reinforce what Marissa said, even if we took the estimates that she shared with you about the need that we're going to have between now and 2050 to support the energy transition and the other sectoral needs that she described, even if you cut that in half, we have a huge challenge ahead of us. We're going to need a lot more production. So none of this goes away, even if the interest or the support for EVs is declining in some parts of the world. I think it's still this need continues. The need for more energy production is not going to go away. And even if that production is coal fired or even if it's gas fired, you still need a lot more copper for the transmission lines. You still need a lot more steel for the transmission lines. So none of this goes away. The need for much more demand to fuel all sorts of sectors of the Canadian economy is going to require the production of a lot more minerals and metals. So again, to reinforce what I said at the outset, when you think of the amount of mining that is going to have to take place over the next 20 to 30 years, it's pretty staggering. And it's absolutely critical, to use that word again, that we do so responsibly. Canada has a real advantage. We have one of the cleanest electricity grids in the world. 83% of our production is non-emitting, with the potential to grow that, especially if we start to reduce internal trade barriers. And we have our Towards Sustainable Mining standard, which, as I said at the outset, leads the world. So we have some real advantages that I think we need to capitalize on. There's no wonder why Europe is looking to us to be a supplier and a preferred supplier to them. And in the context of a trade war with the United States, I think the industry should be looking at diversifying and at least lessening its dependence on the United States to the extent that new market opportunities open up, recognizing the fact that the U.S. will continue to be a major consumer of Canadian minerals and metals for the foreseeable future. I'll stop there and hand it over to Fotini.
Great. Well, thank you, Pierre, and thank you, Senators, for this opportunity to present to you. Canada's electric vehicle battery supply chain is facing a critical challenge. As been mentioned, whilst $46 billion has already been invested in downstream battery production, for some of the critical minerals required, we currently produce less than half of the necessary amount and have only a quarter of the midstream processing capacity needed to support these factories. Without significant progress in mining and processing, the ability of battery factories to source the required materials from Canada could be jeopardized. As you could see on this slide, to meet the demand from 4 planned battery factories, Canada would need to open 15 new mines and increase the pace of mine development by more than 5 times over the next decade. We will require approximately $24 billion in capital investment, $8.1 billion for mining, and $16.1 billion for midstream processing facilities. However, the return on this investment could be substantial. These efforts could create up to 40,000 direct, indirect, and induced jobs, many in remote regions, and contribute an estimated $16 billion to Canada's GDP annually. There's also a meaningful opportunity to work in partnership with Indigenous communities. As been mentioned, battery factories have chosen to locate in Canada because of our mineral resources. And if we fail to develop these resources, the factories, as Pierre mentioned, will be forced to rely heavily on imports, putting the entire value chain and the economic value remaining in Canada at risk. The good news is for lithium, nickel, and graphite, enough advanced projects exist to meet domestic demand. Some could even support exports. While cobalt will always partially depend on imports, we still need to build out domestic processing capacity. And to be clear, this projection reflects only the demand from Canada's 4 planned battery manufacturing plants. It does not account for the additional demand driven by other clean technologies or the growing need for Canadian critical minerals from our allies around the world. We are currently at a pivotal moment, and Canada cannot leave it solely to the private sector to build out our critical mineral supply chains. Other nations, the US, EU, UK, Japan, South Korea, are making massive strategic investments. Canada needs to match that ambition. A proactive and actionable industrial strategy is essential. That means streamlining and scaling up capital funding to bring new mines online quickly and responsibly. This is about making the most of our mineral wealth and responding to geopolitical pressures by building self-sufficiency and reliability into our supply. One of the biggest roadblocks, as Marissa also mentioned, is access to financing, especially for smaller players in the sector. These companies are pretty good at discovering deposits, but they struggle to find the capital to move from exploration to production. Venture capital plays a pivotal role here. It's what enables companies to conduct the technical and economic studies that de-risk projects and attract institutional investment. We need to support mechanisms that unlock this kind of early stage capital. That's the launch pad for long-term production. The Clean Technology Manufacturing Investment Tax Credit, or the CTM-ITC for short, sends a strong signal that Canada intends to lead in clean technology manufacturing and critical mineral extraction and processing. It is a refundable tax credit designed to encourage capital investment in machinery and in equipment used for clean technology and critical mineral activities in Canada. But to realize its full potential, the credit needs a few targeted improvements. Expand the CTM-ITC to include all minerals and metals essential to clean energy technologies, not just the 6 that Marissa mentioned in terms of the priority metals that are currently listed. Broaden the scope. Currently, the credit applies only to tangible capital equipment. If we want to facilitate mine life expansion or encourage new investment from existing operations, the investment tax credit should also cover intangible but essential development costs such as shaft sinking, tunneling, pre-production stripping, and site preparation. These are critical capital-intensive phases. Including them would help advance more projects in a shorter time frame than building entirely new mines. Enable polymetallic projects. Many of Canada's deposits are polymetallic, but the current high eligibility threshold for the investment tax credit creates barriers for projects producing more than one metal. This risks excluding essential materials like copper, which is foundational to clean technologies from electric vehicles to transmission infrastructure. A legislative fix was proposed in the 2024 Fall Economic Statement, but it will need to be introduced and passed by the next government once Parliament resumes. Additional to the CTM ITC improvements, we are also recommending modernizing tax treatment. Flow-through shares have long been a critical financing tool for exploration. We are recommending the reclassification of key development costs as Canadian exploration expenses, reverting back to pre-2013 rules, which would improve tax treatment for construction and early production phases, making it easier for companies to raise capital through flow-through shares and support the construction and production of their critical mineral projects. Beyond tax tools, we need to target public investment strategically. We need to direct the Export Development Canada and the Business Development Bank of Canada to prioritize upstream mining projects. We need to continue to leverage the Strategic Innovation Fund to close financing gaps. Infrastructure is equally critical. Many of our most promising deposits are located in remote and northern regions, requiring sustained federal investments in roads, in energy, and digital access to unlock their potential. MAC is pleased to see infrastructure projects supported through Natural Resources Canada's Critical Minerals Infrastructure Fund, which is a positive step forward. However, to effectively close that infrastructure gap, the government must increase investment and further capitalize this fund. Doing so will help de-risk projects, enhance their economic viability, attract investor capital, and accelerate their transition in production. And globally, it's essential to address predatory pricing practices, which Pierre also mentioned, particularly those originating from countries like China, which often involves selling products below cost to capture market share. This leads to an oversupply, it drives prices down, and it renders projects uneconomic. Such tactics undermine the long-term viability of industries, compelling producers to lower prices or risk being driven out of the market. Ultimately, this stalls critical investments and it hampers growth. To stabilize the market and secure long-term demand for domestic minerals, it's important to implement price floors, stockpiling strategies, and government-led offtake agreements. Now, let's be honest, permitting in Canada is still far too complex, it's fragmented, and it's slow. It undermines our ability to compete globally and discourages investors, especially when decisions are unpredictable or they're duplicative. We're calling for a coordinated fix. Federal and provincial reviews should be better aligned. One project, one assessment must become a reality. Indigenous consultation should be meaningful, but also streamlined and tailored between jurisdictions to avoid administrative burdens for Indigenous communities. Federal impact assessments should stick to federal issues, not duplicate provincial work. These are smart, pragmatic changes that still protect environmental and Indigenous rights, but they restore confidence and also predictability. And to conclude, we believe mining is strategic for the climate, for the economy, and for Canada's global leadership. Investing in new projects now will diversify our economy, it will create jobs, and strengthen our position in global supply chains. And here's what we need. We need smart investments in development and processing. We need competitive incentives to attract and also de-risk capital, faster, clear permitting, infrastructure to open access to remote areas, and stronger Indigenous partnerships built on equity and inclusion. Canada has the resources and the responsibility to lead the net zero transition, and we should seize this moment. And on behalf of Pierre and me, thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. We look forward to your questions.
Well, that was dense and helpful. Great information from both of you, Pierre and Fotini. And I want to just say that we will share the slide deck, and we will also be sharing the recording of this session with everybody, and with our colleagues who are wish they could be with us and are not unable to be with us. So yes, that's wonderful. So now we're going to move quickly to our final wrap statements by Marissa. Marissa, could you please start us off with an overview of the role of critical minerals? Oh, no, that's the wrong one. You already did this. Could you now tell us how Canada can ensure that its critical minerals strategy is fully aligned with our net zero targets? And we've heard that from our two previous speakers, and you also introduced that. And what policy tools or governance models could help us ensure sustainable and responsible mining practices and partnerships, particularly in partnership with Indigenous and other rural communities? And again, we just heard Fotini refer to that, but if you could wrap this session, the panel part up, so then we can move on to the questions. I know there's going to be many, but really happy to have you now round this out, Marissa. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and I think as Pierre said earlier, a lot of my comments were mentioned by Fotini just now, so I'll keep this nice and short and kind of wrap it up so we can move to questions. But I think in this part, I just wanted to come back to kind of the policy situation again and the policy challenge that maybe Canadian governments are facing right now in terms of critical minerals. So this is really an issue that has multiple dimensions, and we've heard a lot of them in the previous comments in the session today. I'm just going to wrap them up again to really show the different layers of decision making that are at play here. So undeniably, we have heard a lot about the enormous economic opportunity for Canada in that sector, and the importance of developing Canadian critical minerals fast for energy security, for its meeting its emission reduction targets, and then national security at a larger world stage in response to kind of the geopolitical tensions that we see heightening around this sector and in many trade relationships right now. We've also heard about that enormous investment gap. There's a need for financing. Money is not flowing right now at the scale and pace as it should to realize that potential that we have identified. And there are other layers as well that we've heard about here, and a couple of them I just want to provide a bit more detail on. So the first one is, Fotini mentioned that towards sustainable mining framework, mining itself has, of course, environmental impacts. Overall, we're seeing that the clean energy economy that will be enabled by critical minerals will require less resource extraction than a fossil fuel-driven economy, but there are environmental impacts of mining that we must not forget about. And I'm going to mention a few here on biodiversity. For example, the Ring of Fire is a very mineral-rich area in Northern Ontario, is also among the world's largest peatland areas. We're looking at impact in terms of water pollution from mining tailings. The Mount Polley mining disaster from 2014 maybe comes to mind here, but even last year, Victoria Gold Mine in Yukon last year, there were significant implications for health and safety of the natural environment and local communities. And mining end of life, cleanup and reclamation. There are environmental implications here, and then also in terms of carbon emissions. So these emissions can come up from using diesel-fueled machinery in mines, and there's a huge move towards electrifying mines right now, and these emissions are certainly a relatively small share of Canadian emissions today, but still keeping an eye on that. If we expand these operations under business as usual, the share of emissions will also rise. And there's also questions around the stored carbon in the landscape that would be used for mining. So again, coming back to the Ring of Fire example, those peatlands, if they are turned into or industrially developed, there will be carbon released through those activities as well. So that's just another dimension of the policy challenge that we're looking here. Indigenous rights has come up multiple times before. So there are still some important issues around unresolved land claims. There's a track record, certainly, of insufficient consultations by governments and mining companies for previous mining and resource development projects. And there is uneven implementation of the principles of free, prior, informed consent across Canada. And this is really, I think, here about developing these projects in full partnership with Indigenous communities. So going forward, so enabling Indigenous communities to take ownership of projects, fully participate in the economic opportunities that we're seeing, and becoming true partners in those developments if they choose to do so. And then, of course, the last layer I'm going to mention, Futeni just provided a good overview, is that question of regulatory approvals and timelines. How long does it take to get a Canadian mine actually from planning into production? That has also certainly been in the headlines over the last weeks. Multiple governments across Canada have announced measures to fast track certain projects, and we've seen a little bit of backlash there if these fast tracking approaches are maybe seen as being compromising on environmental standards and Indigenous rights and consultation. So that's kind of the whole complexity or the multiple dimensions of policy decisions that Canadian governments are looking at. So what is the way forward here? And here in my last remarks for today, I'll draw a bit more on our policy analysis in the forthcoming report. And just for this research, we conducted numerous interviews with experts, online survey, extensive engagement. And what we're suggesting here is kind of a policy package that could help unlock that investment that we need in the sector and develop projects fast. And we're looking specifically at 3 sets of policies. I'm not going to go into great detail here, just for the sake of time. I'm happy to answer more questions. The first one is really policies to share the financial risks with investors. And there's actually a lot of overlap, I think, with what Futeni presented. We're specifically focusing on the high price volatility in global markets and the challenges that can present to investors in these projects, and some government measures or some policy measures that government can take here are offtake agreements. Futeni had mentioned them before, other financial risk sharing agreements to insulate Canadian producers from the large uncertainties and the sometimes very significant price swings that we're seeing in global markets. That, of course, makes investment decisions a lot harder. The second set of policies are really policies to strengthen Indigenous rights in the project development and enable partnerships. And so here we're seeing a big role for governments in supporting capacity building in Indigenous communities to enable them to make informed decisions about if and how they want to participate in these projects, and participate in projects in ways that the community chooses to. And that's through the entire project development process. So with kind of a large number of new projects coming online, the capacities that are demanded from Indigenous communities in terms of consultation, decision-making, participation can be significant. So there's a role here for government to support those capacity building activities. And this could also involve improving communities' access to capital. If a community chooses to actually become a project owner or acquire equity shares in these projects, there are ways that government can support or widen that access to capital. So communities, again, have the resources they need to become involved and partners in the way they choose to. Third set of policies, then coming back to those environmental risks of mining, and we've heard how much voluntary action is happening in the sector on issues such as tailings management or mine closures, end of life. And we would just recommend over time turning these voluntary standards and these high international best practices that Canada is doing in a lot of ways already into regulatory frameworks, anchoring them down in regulation. And that is also, if we're thinking about the local communities, the social support, social acceptance of a ramp up of mining activities in Canada. Building confidence in the regulatory mandatory frameworks for these environmental standards will be key here. And we've also seen in the past that local opposition to projects or community conflict to resource development projects can really lead to a lot of costs for the mining companies as well, create a lot of uncertainty, lengthen regulatory approval processes, and lead to litigation in the end as well. So those are the three sets of policies that we're key policy packages that we are here suggesting. As I said, I skipped over a few things, happy to answer more questions on that, but we think that that combination of policies can really do a lot in the short run to provide a lot more certainty and predictability for investors, accelerate project development, but without compromising environmental standards and protection and Indigenous rights and participation. Thank you so much. Happy to answer questions.
So thank you very much, Marissa, for your presentations, and also to Fatoni and Pierre. A lot of material you covered, and really impressive how you covered such depth of material in this period of time. So we're about to move into the questions and answers. But before we do that, a couple of things I'd ask participants to do is we like to capture photos of the group for our own records and whatnot. So if you could turn on your cameras, that'd be great. That would help with taking that group picture. We also want to let you know that if you have a question, please use your virtual hand. That's my real hand. That's not my virtual hand. But if you just put your virtual hand up, I'll try my best to monitor that and make sure that your questions are responded to. If we run out of time, and we've got till about 12:15, so we'll end at about just a little before that so Mary can wrap up. But if you have questions and we haven't gotten to them, if you could submit them to either Mary or myself, we'll get them to the panelists and ask them if they would mind just responding, and we'll get the responses to you as appropriate. We're also going to say that you need to use a Senate-approved headset. If you don't have that headset, please type your question in the chat box. Again, we'll monitor that. And finally, we'd be happy to open the floor after the senators are completed. If staff have questions, to please raise your hands or submit, as I've stated earlier. So with that, we'll move into the Q&A. And I see Senator Cardozo has his virtual hand up, but he's using his real hand. But I will move. I will move to Senator Cardozo. And unmute, please. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you, Senator Quinn. And Senator Coyle, thanks so much for organizing this. And thank you to our guests who are here. Sorry, I couldn't find my virtual hand, so I decided I'd use my real hand. My question, or it's more a comment. So we're in this really critical period for Canada in terms of this particular issue, as with many other issues. But one of the things I find, as a senator, having been here for a couple of years, is that virtually everybody who talks to us feels that the federal government and all governments are seriously underfunding their sector. I'm not talking about by a few dollars, I'm talking about by large amounts of money. So whether it's defense these days, or whether it's infrastructure, or whether it's autism or care for seniors, virtually everybody rightfully feels they're underfunded. So when you talk about strategic investments, building roads and infrastructure and so forth, and by the way, I totally get the case you're making, and I think it's very timely. So just a comment, I think one has to somehow sharpen the ask that you're making. But my question is more on Indigenous consultation. I think you've addressed a number of the things. You've talked about having meaningful consultation. You've talked about capacity building from the Indigenous side, and I think that's very useful, provided it is totally developed, or at least largely by Indigenous people. But there's still a requirement for consultation, that even if you have a growing number of people who are from the Indigenous community, who are aware of all the scientific issues and familiar with negotiation and so forth, they still would need to do meaningful consultation, as you've talked about, free, prior, and informed consent. with Indigenous communities, whether it's in the Ring of Fire or elsewhere. So how do you make that happen? Because that still remains to be an informed piece. And I think when political parties are talking about steamrolling this through, it's not going to happen that way.
Do you want to answer that, Pierre?
Well, it's more comment. If anybody wants to respond, that's fine. But I just want to leave those two as a couple of comments, really.
Let's go to Pierre. Go ahead, sir.
No, a couple of quick reactions, Senator, and nice to see you again.
You too.
First, just on your opening comment in terms of the ask, I'd just like to emphasize that the investment tax credit, which is sort of the central tax ask of this sector, which is really already exists, we're asking for it to be fine-tuned, is not a subsidy, in that we only get it if we invest. So the extent to which the investment tax credit incentivizes new mining investment actually brings revenue to government, and creates jobs and creates opportunities for Indigenous peoples and all the rest of it. It's not actually a handout the way sort of other programs like SIF are, where the government is actually giving money out. This is only a credit in return. So in that sense, we see it as a really powerful tool, and one that has far less implications for the government's fiscal health than others. In terms of the broader question on Indigenous consultation, there are over 500 agreements in place between Canadian mining companies and Indigenous peoples across the country. And for the most part, the examples of conflict in Canada between mining companies and Indigenous communities are few and far between. You may hear about them when they emerge because they tend to attract news. But for the most part, you don't hear about them at all because agreements are signed and concluded long before projects come into operation. We've been doing this now for 30-some. We pioneered impact benefit agreements. It's pretty inconceivable for any mining project today to be advanced without agreements in place. They do take time to negotiate, but at the same time, both sides have gotten really good at it. Especially some Indigenous communities, they know they're managing multiple agreements with multiple companies. They know how to sit down and negotiate an agreement. They know what they want. There are still parts of Canada where some communities have had limited to no experience with mining, and if the project emerges on their traditional lands, it can be more tricky and it can take longer because there's less familiarity and less comfort with what the sector brings. Our TSM framework really helps the industry prepare for that and provides assurances, I think, to communities around the kinds of actions and the kind of conduct that the industry is promising. Where I agree with your point that around real risks, we need to improve the timeliness of project approvals. A lot of our focus has always been on government time, coordination between departments, trying to do more things in parallel than sequentially, coordinating between different levels of government and not repeating multiple forms of multiple consultation activities for the same project by different departments or different levels of government, which is just adds burden to communities as well, as opposed to streamlining by cutting corners or doing less or neglecting the Crown's duty. So I still think there's lots of opportunities to improve how we to improve the timelines associated with environmental reviews. But I agree with you that we can't do things in a way that just increases the risk of litigation, because that just sets us back. And you don't want to be tied up in court. The last comment I'd make is the government's $5 billion, now $10 billion fund to to support Indigenous participation in the natural resources economy is also very significant. Whether it's equity ownership directly in projects or in the associated infrastructure with those projects, that I think does really help move the needle. I'll close with this one, but I often reflect on the Voisey's Bay mine, which is one of the world's, most important nickel mines. It was caught up in conflict in the early days. A lot of it had to do with unsettled and unresolved land claims. It was such a significant project, both the government of Newfoundland and Labrador and the government of Canada at the time recognized the significance of that project and sat down and did their duty with the Inuit and the Innu. And now that project has, 60% Indigenous employment, 90% Indigenous procurement. It's one of the best examples in the country because the government recognized their role in enabling that to happen. And that is going to be case by case, but at times governments really do have to step in to create the conditions for the private sector to succeed.
Thank you very much for that. What I'd like to do now is to ask my two colleagues, premièrement, Senator Milva Deschamps, et ensuite Senator Gignac, de poser leurs questions.
I'll ask them to ask their questions.
Can then cut in, and I'll watch for the hands of the panelists. Premièrement, Senatrice.
Senator Milva Deschamps first. Thank you. I would like to ask Mr. Gratton a question in French, since he understands French. You and I have talked about other issues before. I'd like to talk about the international context currently. You talked about China being a superpower within these critical mineral issues. I read something recently about how we really need these critical minerals. Will oil drilling be replaced by critical minerals? There's a lot going on in the world right now. Will we be pushing more children into forced labor in these mines? Are these risks we should be taking into consideration, according to you? Of course, Trump's administration has cut off all funding that might encourage such human rights abuses. Of course, there's a Canadian perspective here, but I'd like to hear your thoughts more globally.
Merci, Senatrice Deschamps. Avant votre réponse,
audible for the interpreter?
Je vous demande
I'd like to ask my colleague, Senator Gignac, to also ask his question.
On vous entend pas.
Yeah.
We can't hear you, Senator Gignac. You are muted.
This mistake. So thanks our colleagues for organizing that and guest speaker. So it was very interesting. So it's about technology risk. I explained because is it when I heard that BYD, for example, in China, car maker will have a new battery which will be only 5 minutes to recharge starting next year. What is the technology risk? And what should guide government? Because, if we go, for example, in the energy, it's integrated from downstream to upstream for the big oil company. So this is a risk for Canada to be involved and support the mining development and so on. If suddenly, notice what happened with Northvolt in Quebec, for example. So if government spend a lot of money, but do not have this guarantee of integration, it's suddenly we change the rule of the game and we have no longer 100% on the China vehicle. All this project, billions and billions demand from EV battery will be gone, and suddenly we can lose money given So I apologize to ask that, but I'm a former Minister of Economic Development Quebec and Natural Resources, so I really enjoy and want to develop the sector natural resource, but we have to be careful about public money to engage, to support if we have no guarantee about the clientele. Thanks.
Thank you for the two questions. I'm going to ask the panelists to be very short, very succinct. We only have 2 minutes left. And I'd ask my colleagues that if you wish, submit the questions and we'll get more wholesome response. But at least now we can have 2 minutes. We only have 2 minutes for an initial response. First, to you, Pierre.
Pour répondre à la question
I will answer Sénatrice Miville Deschênes' question. I hope not, although I can't guarantee anything. Of course, the interpreter would like to signal that it's hard to hear the speaker because of his the way he's put his hand in front of his mouth. The sound is a bit muffled.
Angleterre.
There are laws in Australia and England, and I think that there are some protections for these countries, but Chinese companies, we can't really monitor what they'll be doing, and we can't guarantee anything.
Anybody else want to join in? Est-ce que des autres commentaires?
Other questions or comments?
Dr. Beck?
Maybe just a quick response to the second question. We're ready to just 1 minute. Yes, I think these are demand projections that we're talking about. They're substantive. There is a risk. These are all still emerging technologies, and the technological pathways no one can really foresee. I think there is a consistent the projections across various organizations and sources are consistent that we're going to see a huge increase in demand. But yeah, we're discussing that in our report as well. There's certainly demand uncertainty in terms of what will the dominant technologies be of the future, but the range of technologies that use these critical minerals seems to be robust, and projections are consistent there at this point. That was the one thing. The other thing, in terms of public money and investment, I think there are specific instruments, especially if we're thinking about them as risk-sharing instrument rather than straight-out subsidies to these projects. Again, we'll go into greater detail in our report, but there are some smart policies that governments can enact that where the fiscal burden stays relatively small, and it can still have a huge risk-reducing impact on investors. So I'm thinking here about offtake agreements that kick in if prices fall below a certain level, or what we know as contracts for difference. We've seen in other markets, electricity and carbon markets, where governments really only step in if the risk case scenario sets in. So it's a bit of a different model. So actually to be fiscally smart and conservative and still provide support for the industry. So there are interesting instruments here that governments can use to reconcile these risks with the need for support to get investment going right now.
And thank you. And I've been advised that one of our new members to the group, one of our new senators, has a quick question, and we'll need a quick answer. We've got about a minute or two. So Senator Papatalo, would you please pose your question? Unless she's disappeared.
Oh, she's there.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I took off my headset thinking we'd run out of time.
Yeah.
Just quickly, I wondered if the organization or the Institute has thought about how to link the extraction to the processing so that when these projects are being linked in that fashion, governments are more interested, provincial, federal, Indigenous groups, because the opportunities for jobs is greater. So the processes could move through, its pace is quicker. And, even today, Scotiabank CEO calling on more investment in infrastructure for resource export. And to be honest, I think Canadians are tired of that. And this is always the issue. Sure, we want it out of the ground, but nobody focuses on the processing portion. And the last time a premier did that, one already referenced today, half the country loved it. The other half hated it because they were forcing processing to land in Newfoundland. But really, that's the last time I can remember governments being aggressive to force processing, where lots of the money is and lots of the jobs. And we talk about the first half extracting a lot and really not enough on the processing. I just wondered if you had a comment.
I'll go to Dr. Beck for a very short response and quickly over to Pierre.
Yeah, super quick response. Yes, it's hugely important. We need to look at critical minerals from a value chain perspective. In our specific report right now, we're actually focusing on the upstream, as there's a lot of talk about it, but the actual research and the actual money that has been flowing has been the least at that upper end of the value chain. So in this report, we're scoping it, specifically looking at extraction with the understanding that this is one part of a value chain that overall needs to be developed. And I think, I don't remember if it was Pierre or Foutini earlier speaking about if Canada is actually only focusing on the processing part, or only focusing on the extraction part. What is missing makes us vulnerable to these geopolitical tension and supply chain vulnerabilities that we're seeing across the world. So yes, it's an integrated project. We specifically have looked at extraction right now.
Great, thank you. And Pierre, very quickly.
Muted.
Yeah, sorry. There's always a desire. A lot of people talk about why don't we have a copper smelter in BC, where so much of our copper is mined and then exported to Asia. The margins in smelting and refining are very, very thin, again, because of China. They've built out so much capacity. It's very hard to get into. The US has ambitions to try to improve its smelting and refining capacity. It's going to be challenging for them as well, particularly without some kind of state intervention. But it's not to say it can't happen. Usually it takes the mega project like a Voisey's Bay to justify the economics. And today we would only build such a factory or a smelter on Tidewater. We wouldn't build them where we built them today. I just conclude, though, by just acknowledging that unlike many other mining jurisdictions in the world, we're blessed that we actually already do have the whole value chain. We actually do have smelters and refineries, fewer than we used to, but we do have smelters and refineries. We're rebuilding a new cobalt refinery in Ontario, and we recycle. We have recycling capacity as well that we need to strengthen. Marissa talked about the need to recycle. We currently have like a closed loop for lead acid batteries in your conventional automobile. We need to fine tune our existing smelters and refineries so that they can recapture the EV batteries of the future, so that we can have a closed loop system for those as well. These are the sorts of things that actually SIF is fortunately focused on. But yeah, the entire value chain has to be the focus.
So thank you very much, everyone. And on behalf of Marion, I want to say thank you to our panelists. Unless Mary, do you want to kick in now?
Yes, I just want to wrap. Thank you to you, Jim, and a very, very sincere thanks to Marissa, Pierre, and Foutini for sharing your really deep expertise on this vital issue. Your insights have certainly given us a clearer picture of the scale of the opportunity and the work that we all need to do as legislators to ensure the opportunity is realized and is done responsibly, sustainably, and equitably. Thanks also to my staff and for all of your help. And a big shout out and congratulations to Devin Blaskovich, who's with us here today, who will be starting a new career with the International Development Research Center later this month. Thank you as well to all of the colleagues who are able to join us today. If you haven't yet joined Senators for Climate Solutions, please know that you are welcome, and we'd be happy to have you join. You'll be hearing from us soon, Senators, as we'll be sending out a survey to get your feedback on our activities, for those of you who've been with us for a while, our activities to date, and to get input from also our new Senators on future directions as we plan for Senators for Climate Solutions 2.0, which we hope to launch in the fall. And to let you know, we've been talking for a couple of years about being involved in a citizens' assembly on climate. And it looks like we will very soon be involved in a youth climate assembly. So we'll keep you posted on that. So just thanks again to our wonderful panel. When we first met with each of them, we really didn't know what we didn't know. Now we know a whole lot more, but there's still some major gaps, but we know now who to go to get that information we need to do our jobs as senators representing the people of Canada. So thank you all. Merci. Walaleo miigwech.
Yes.